Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by a friend and author and former colleague, James T. Keane, who is the author of this wonderful new book, Reading Culture Through Catholic Eyes, 50 Writers, Thinkers, and Firebrands Who Challenge and Change Us. Jim is a senior editor at America Magazine, which is published by the Jesuits of America. He himself was a Jesuit seminarian and received an MDiv from the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, as well as an MFA from Columbia University. I think his most important credential, however, is that he served for 5 years as an editor at Orbis Books, where I'd like to think that I taught him everything he knows, except that that wouldn't be true. His real love is literature and culture and how that connects with matters of faith. So his position at America is really the perfect place for him. And his famous colleague, Father Jim Martin, has said that he's the best writer on the staff, and I would not disagree. This book comes from a regular column that he's been writing for America for many years, which may account for its somewhat Jesuit-centric view of culture. But it's really a book for anyone who's interested in writing and writers, especially but not exclusively those who bring a Catholic perspective to their work. So, Jim, welcome. And I wonder if I could start by asking you to describe how you whittled your many columns down to 50 figures and what was the criteria that you used for your selection?
Thank you, Robert, and thanks for having me. This did begin as a weekly column for America, which now is about 3 years old. So I have essentially over 150 columns at this point. And some of this is low-hanging fruit, right? There are some authors that we all consider, oh, that's a Catholic author, that's a spiritual author, so it's easy to write something about, or it's easy to pick someone like Flannery O'Connor or Walker Percy or someone like that. But my criteria were to find sometimes diamonds in the rough in different stories. And I always loved someone with a little bit of spice. So you find some of these characters, one example would be Leonard Feeney, who was this
Yes.
Jesuit who became famous for being excommunicated and kicked out of the Jesuits for starting a religious order that denied the doctrine of salvation outside the church. And he ended up becoming sort of a notorious figure. But at one point, he was the literary editor and the poetry editor of America. And he's a very sort of saucy guy. He had these sort of crazy opinions that they let him print every week in the magazine. And then, you have writers like Mary Karr or Mary Gordon, or this woman, Moira Walsh, who wrote a movie column for America for 37 years, who they just were a little bit of a sort of twinkle in their eye or a little bit of edge to their prose, I think that I liked. And so it was a matter of picking some of the obvious ones, but then also finding some of the ones that maybe would be more entertaining that I kind of enjoyed reading.
Well, that's one of the pleasures of the book is that diversity. And as you say, there are some of the usual suspects you would expect to find. And then there are all these curveballs and surprises. There are people there who would be in anyone's list of favorites. There'd be people you realize you would like to know. And there are also people you're just as glad that you've never known. But you write it with such respect and empathy, even for Father Feeney with some of his more outlandish ideas. You give him his due, and particularly you respect people as writers, almost regardless of what they have to say.
Yeah, and I think that obviously at one point there was some writer who had been canceled, and the excuse I used for writing about him was that we still read people like Norman Mailer and Philip Roth, even though we know they were kind of terrible.
Yeah.
And I was on Jesuitical, the America podcast for millennial Catholics the other day, and I should have prepared better because I forgot that at the end of every episode they asked the guest, if you could pick anyone in the world, who would you canonize? Who would
Oh,
you make
yeah.
a saint,
Wow.
living or dead? And I had not prepared. And what they asked me was if you could pick anyone in your book. And I said Graham Greene. And
Wow.
then I was like, he's
Uh,
a hard candidate for sainthood.
Called himself a Catholic agnostic, didn't he?
Right, right, right. And, had some irregular personal habits. But I mean, it is true. I think that there's this line from Yeats. You choose perfection of the life or of the work, and I think a critic has to do that when they look at an author too. You're not looking for a perfect life. You're looking for the perfect work, uh, in a way. Otherwise, you don't write anything.
Well, one of the things that really shines through is your love of writing and the writers who do it. And one of your ways of kind of looking at writing and culture is even to quote extensively from famous writers writing about other famous writers. And so there's like a wider conversation. It's not just your voice in there.
Yeah, and I mean, I think sometimes that's an easy cheat because someone else will describe someone well. But one of the things I enjoyed about some of these folks, especially if it was someone obscure, is that if you can find what someone well-known said about them, it puts them in context.
Mhm.
So, for example, I wrote about Miles Connolly, who, I mean, a lot of Catholics, maybe of a certain age, know him as the writer of Mr. Blue, the
Mhm.
short novel from the 20s. Um, but he was also a screenwriter in Hollywood, and he was best friends with Frank Capra.
Mhm.
And he helped write It's a Wonderful Life and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And Capra, he was godfather to Capra's kids. But I found this quote about him from Capra, which said he had the mien of a dyspeptic water buffalo. Uh, and I mean, I can't write that, but people know who Capra is, and it's a great phrase. So,
Well, that's your first chapter in the book is the one on Miles Connolly, and it begins with his own sentence. Why why are American Catholic writers so boring?
right, which is, I mean, I just found that to be the perfect lead. I think the two best starting lines I've found thus far in all of these columns is Miles Connolly starting a piece in For America in 1930s. Why are American Catholic writers so boring? And then Mary Karr starts one of her books, a memoir. Every line in this book is a lie.
Yeah, every line in your book is not boring. I'll have to give it that. Uh, you obviously have some of your favorites. You mentioned Graham Greene, but you're also very fond of J.F. Powers, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah, and have been for a long time. One of the inspirations for this project in general, which was a book I always wanted to write, is I had a philosophy professor in college. I was a philosophy major at Loyola Marymount, and he one semester a course propped up in the catalog. It was um, philosophy and fiction,
Mhm.
and it was not at all that. It was on Catholic novels, and he was kind of an idiosyncratic guy. He later ran for governor of California because philosophy professors. What are you going to do? But the course had a lot of these sort of well-known books. Walker Percy, Flannery O'Connor, uh, Chinua Achebe. But Graham Greene, obviously, but it also had Walker J.F. Powers' first novel, Mort to Urban,
Mm,
which won the National Book Award in I think 1962. And Powers didn't write another novel for like 30 years
mm,
until he wrote Wheat That Springeth Green in the 90s. In between, he wrote short stories and various things, but those were really his only two books. And both novels and most of his stories were about priests.
mm.
And you heard me say this at another event. I said his obituary in the New York Times said J.F. Powers dies at 72, wrote about priests.
Yes.
I found it kind of insulting. I was like, well, would you say Ernest Hemingway dies at such and such, wrote about drunks?
Tolstoy
Herman
wrote
Melville
about
dies, wrote
Cossacks.
about a whale. You know. But priests were like the focus of a lot of his stories. But I think what that gave him is something that another writer, I don't even remember who it was anymore, said at one point is that they were jealous of Catholic writers because Catholic writers started out with a compass where you had a right and a wrong, you had a dark and a light, and it allowed you to work within those confines in a way that allowed you to narrow the focus. And I think for J.F. Powers, like making priests his protagonists allowed him to narrow the focus in a lot of ways because the priests end up not being these sort of otherworldly characters. The stories are all set in Minnesota and the upper Midwest, and these guys are kind of you can kind of see them as like bank managers or insurance salesmen. They talk about the company, they talk about the boss, getting a promotion. They meet for cards. They have drinks at lunch, and they're just very human characters with very human foibles. But he has this, because they're all priests. There's certain limitations on what they're going to do, and there's certain boundaries that if they approach or break, are more interesting in terms of fiction. Uh, but yes, I always did greatly enjoy his books and his stories.
Well, it raises the question, what is a Catholic writer, and what distinguishes those kind of writers of the golden age, Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, from some of the contemporary Catholics that you include in your book?
Yeah. Well, I will admit that there's a bit of a lie in the title of this book, because a lot of these authors either are not Catholic, were not Catholic, or in some cases were sort of openly, negative about the church. And so it's Catholic with a small c in a lot of cases. But I would say that, like, for the golden age of Catholic writers, I have a very conventional sense that I would steal from someone like David Tracy, who, or, he was popularized in a way for sort of your average reader by Andrew Greeley. And they both talked about the Catholic imagination as being one that, first of all, sacramental. There's a sense of the world. The world can be very troublesome and harm you and full of suffering, but it is at its essence good. And the sacraments are part of that, but also the sacramental in everyday life, the way God intrudes into life. And then an analogical sense of the world, where what we do in life is somehow paralleled by what happens with the heavenly host, what happens with God. And the sense that what we do on the mundane level is paralleled by what happens on the sublime level, the way liturgy parallels dinner, the way the activities of the other sacraments parallel our daily lives. Uh, and then, obviously, a journey of some sense towards confusion to conviction, or towards from dimness to clarity, I guess, that seeing through a mirror darkly. That what I would say for the sort of golden age, what you described. So like a period from like 1958 to 1968, when you have Walker Percy, Edwin O'Connor, Flannery O'Connor, J.F. Powers, Caroline Gordon, all these people are winning like every award imaginable. But for, I think, like contemporary writers, if you looked at like a world that from 1980 to onward, or even 1990 to onward, it's those same things, but there's also, I think, two other things. Is one is the change within the church and society, and the way that affects one's faith and one's milieu becomes much more important. So you take an author like Alex McDermott, who obviously like has these classic Catholic novels, uh, and I would say Charming Billy would be a good example of that. It sort of has all those themes. But then you look at some of her other books, and her characters start becoming men who come back from Vietnam, or women who go off and experience the sexual revolution. And then later and later, that becomes sort of more and more like the struggles of a church that changes,
Mhm.
so that the old standbys are no longer there. I think you see that very clearly in like Mary Gordon's fiction, like her famous novel, Final Payments, where it's a woman who takes care of her father, who goes by all the old ways, and she has a clearly defined role, and then when he dies, she sort of enters the world as a woman in her late 20s, early 30s, and the world has completely changed. And so the old certainties are gone, and I think that plays a part in it too, for like contemporary Catholic writing.
Mhm. Mhm.
That sense of like, all right, finding a stay against confusion, finding a home somewhere in a very confusing world.
Well, even Mary Gordon shares in common with J.F. Powers and some of those Catholic writers that she's kind of describing a kind of Catholic milieu. Um, and that contrasts with, let's say, an author like Flannery O'Connor, uh, who very deliberately is not writing about Catholics,
Yeah.
the backwoods evangelists and kinds of eccentric, crazy kind of characters, and yet maintains, and it becomes clear when you read her letters, that her Catholic point of view is is the whole basis of her sense of reality, the reality that she's describing.
Yeah. And she wrote an essay for America at one point, which is in that book that I think
Mystery and Manners.
yes, Mystery and Manners, where she was pretty harsh on your average Catholic reader, and she talked a little bit about why she didn't write Catholic, didn't write with these sort of obviously Catholic themes. And part of it is that she said, like, your average Catholic reader wants something to be either pious or pornographic. It either has to be shocking or it has to be this boring assertion of the truth.
Hmm.
And someone asked me just the other day, they said, why is Catholic fiction so violent?
Hmm.
And I said, well, what do you mean? They said, well, they were thinking more of Catholic movies, the famous Catholic directors. You know, why would someone like Scorsese or Coppola just have these shocking acts of violence be so central? I was like, well, I mean, think about Flannery O'Connor. Like, think about A Good Man is Hard to Find.
Yeah.
This comment about, like, she would have been a good woman if someone had held a gun to her head every day of her life.
Right. Right.
That's shocking, right? And I
Yeah.
think O'Connor herself also said once is that you have to speak boldly to the blind, to the deaf. You have to, you
Yeah.
know,
Strange
shine bright
figures.
things to the heart of sight. And so she said, if you want to depict a baptism, you show someone drowning, or something like that, which I think is definitely you can see in her stories, definitely.
Well, the title of the book doesn't actually, maintain that you're writing about Catholics. In fact, it says reading culture through Catholic eyes. So the emphasis is really on the reader or the beholder. In this case, that's essentially you. So I wonder, because you are writing about Thich Nhat Hanh and people who are not Christian at all. So I wonder what does inform a Catholic view of culture and
Yeah.
literature.
Yeah, and I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh, I think you could make a case for in any book because his thought entered the thought of so many people. Like, I mean, friends of yours like Jim Forrest or Dan Berrigan or people like Thomas Merton. There was a dialogue there. I mean, there are some people in the book like Martin Amis. There's no real dialogue there. I mean, I would have written about Christopher Hitchens, but there was even less of a dialogue, a monologue there. But I think some of it is that you're right. It's from the point of view of the reader, of what actually strikes you from someone's. If you have a vision of what appeals to you, your Catholic sensibility, what's going to appeal to you there. So in the case of someone like Martin Amis, who his book Money, which is sort of a not something. I mean, it should definitely have an NC-17 rating on it, right? It's not for the faint of heart. But in the end, it's sort of this book that you could see Graham Greene writing, or you could see come from the pen of any other Catholic, or it could even be a memoir, which it kind of is, I think, in a way, because it's a man who gives himself over to every material excess, but in the end just becomes exhausted, and at the end sort of runs into himself, like both literally and metaphorically, like has to look at himself, and the main character is named Self,
Mm.
and say, who is this person? It's almost like a morality play in a sense.
Mhm.
And so I think my sense is, well, that's Catholic because I thought it was very Catholic. It felt very Catholic to me for all the reasons we talked about earlier. Sometimes that gets harder. I think there are people for whom, I got a chance to interview John Irving a number of years ago, and I put him
Yeah.
in the book. I loved World According to Garp. There are some books that I wasn't as fond of that I think are obviously very Catholic in their tone, like A Prayer for Owen Meany, where you literally have a supernatural intervention on the part of a Christ figure to save someone else. But Irving in our interview, was very harsh on the church, very anti-Catholic, blamed the church for a lot of the ills of the modern world. And so I had a hard case to make there. But nevertheless, in the same sense that we read Flannery O'Connor and we see the misfit or the cripple or the tormented weird preacher as somehow a figure that fulfills our need for a protagonist that is interesting and fulfilling. Irving does the same. You have these characters who are sort of maimed and, a bear is bitten off their arm, or, they grow up in a garbage dump, or they're an itinerant healer or something that fulfill that same need, which is, in some ways, I guess, expressed explicitly, in some ways is internalized by what else you've read. Um, but yeah, I mean, I did cheat in a way by saying, well, I founded Catholic and here's why, you know.
Well, as someone who knows you, I was also, just as interested or struck by what you left out of the book, including Bob Dylan, baseball, dinosaurs.
I did threaten at various points. I mean, why is Vin Scully not in this book? Just because he never wrote a book, wasn't necessarily an author. He should definitely be in there. But yeah, and I will give America credit. The only person they ever told me I just could not write on was William F. Buckley.
Why was that?
I was too mean.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah. Okay. All right.
I
Well,
couldn't I couldn't
there's
be I
a
couldn't I couldn't be charitable. I couldn't put a good spin on it. I couldn't give him the plus sign.
but
But
there's a tradition though in America. One of your previous editors you described as the meanest editor in the world. That was the title of the chapter. Who is that? I forget.
Well, I mean, there were a number of them in a row because there was
Francis
Father
Talbot.
Feeney,
Yeah.
and
Right.
then there was Francis Talbot, and then there was Father Canavan, and each one was sort of spicier and saltier than the last. But Talbot, yeah, he was special. He he hated James Joyce, said he was a scurrilous pervert. And he had such a long career that he reviewed James Joyce. He reviewed Ulysses in 1924, which is sort of classic old America to review a book 4 years after it came out, right? But then he also reviewed like Grapes of Wrath and East of Eden, like 40 years later.
Mm.
Um, and he hated Steinbeck. Thought he was sort of like a fake Catholic who had, given up the truth of the faith for these, silly falsities. But all his reviews, he would sort of have these ways of saying things that I wouldn't get away with anymore. It's
Yeah.
like some
Right.
of the things he would say. And one of my colleagues at America, Tim Reed, he said, if you look at old reviews from a lot of magazines in that era, that was true in a way, is that a reviewer could use a certain style that sounded snarky and mean, but was actually dealing with the material in a more substantial way. Whereas, I think the temptation in an age of sound bites and clickbait is to just, attack the source, attack the author himself. But yeah, those guys like Talbot, I find them endlessly entertaining. I mean, just a guy who I think in any other way of life would just be such an odd character. But, because he was ended up in the Jesuits, he ended up the literary editor and then the editor in chief of America. And, then like went off and wrote this biography of Jean de Brebeuf, one of the martyrs of French Canada.
Mhm.
There was another guy. He didn't make it into the book just because, I did have to pick 50. But his name was C.J. McNaspy,
Mhm.
and he was friends with Flannery O'Connor. His friends with these other sort of famous Southern writers. He's from the South. Wrote a book on the Jesuit reductions in Paraguay, which are sort of the subject of the mission. Liam Neeson.
Read that book.
He also wanted to. He had plans to build a. He proposed a chapel to be built on the moon in the 60s.
Wow.
Had plans for it. He proposed an undersea chapel that would just sail around the world and surface in various uh, points and have masts set on deck and then go back under the water. It was going to be called the Cardinal Bea in honor of
Those were more concepts of a plan. Uh,
Yes, you're right. You're right. Yeah, as has been famously said by another oddball. And then one of his best ones or worst ones was they named him formation director for one of the Jesuit provinces, the guy in charge of getting everyone from the novitiate all the way to ordination. And he said, maybe we should close all these houses of study, all these places off in the woods where the men study philosophy and theology, and it should be more, integrated learning where they go to different sites so they study on the way. So why don't we buy a 747 and put all 400 guys on it and
yeah.
just fly them from place to place, and then they So,
Obvious danger in that, isn't there?
right. Well, you can see what would happen if there was an accident. Yes. But
There go the Jesuits.
yes, but it didn't go anywhere for a number of reasons. But he was sort of an interesting character too. You know, he smoked this corncob pipe, and he was just an oddball. Again, a guy who I think, if it weren't for the worlds of faith and literature, would just be sort of a bit at a loss what to do with himself.
Well, Flannery O'Connor, I think, famously said that anyone who has survived childhood has plenty of material to write
Yeah.
about for the rest of their lives. And I always feel when I meet a Jesuit or someone former Jesuit that to have survived a Jesuit novitiate seems to provide a supply of stories, anecdotes that can last. I never hear you repeat one. Anyway, so like J.F. Powers, you also like to write about priests. You know a lot of priests. But I think that just our conversation here gives a sense of the style of this book, which is just so fun to read. And whether you've heard of these people or you've read them before or they're completely new to you, each one is crisp and just entertaining and gives you something to think about. And you can read them in 5 minutes, as they say in the New York Times, how long it takes to read these things. So anyway, I want to thank you very much for writing this book and publishing with Orbis. And always a pleasure to spend time with you, Jim.
Yes, thank you, Robert, and thank you for the time we worked together, and thank you for trusting me to write this, and thank you for publishing it.
Take care.